And I found it last year, and it was my best purchase of last year. And I really, really wanted it. I wouldn't say I find it especially beautiful. I'm not intending to, but I've looked for it for 20 years.
Where do we go from Angelus, then Breitling, then Certina, then Excelsior Park? What's the next turn?
Yeah, that's I mean one very big part, and as you've seen, because we did a bit of selection together. Of course, I love all the chronographs from the 40s and 50s, which have been quite in fashion a few years back. It's going down again, which is a good thing. So you can find some again. So I took just a very few, which is very hard for me to choose. I have a Longines 13ZN and waterproof, with a snapback, with a very early waterproof, with a little ears for the opening. Exactly, with a very nice gilt dial and it's a beautiful watch delivered to Switzerland, and it's a Türler signed dial.
Oh, I haven't seen
It's a Türler dial, yeah. It's delivered to Türler.
So Türler was just for those of.
It's a big retailer in Zurich.
Right. It's like the Singer dials or the Meister dials.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's I found it in Switzerland, obviously in Zurich, and yeah.
And I think it's always interesting to operate the different calibers to know how they feel. How the Excelsior Park has this very special feel. Yeah. The Angelus one has, and the 13ZN as well. Yeah. This is what is that? The cherry on the cake for Longines, vintage Longines collectors, the 13ZN caliber, right?
Yes,
and chronograph collectors in general.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, because it's probably the nicest chronograph ever. I mean, and you have the super rare 13ZN 12 with the additional, so you have a minute counter and a 12-hour. So in the center you have a 60-minute count and 12-hour. Not on this one, obviously, unfortunately. But of course, I mean, the pinnacle of Longines chronograph collect, especially except all of the super rare split for navigation, which are not. We can discuss if they are really chronograph, but they are split, which are overly rare. It's a pseudograph for the wrist, so to speak. But yeah, so the pinnacle of Longines is the 13ZN12, and next to it is the normal one in steel with black dial. But again, I mean, it's a modern fashion nowadays. People make huge thing about is it steel, is it waterproof, is it a black dial? But I mean, the movement is as beautiful if you take a small 34 millimeters in gold, which you can get for a fraction of the price, and you get basically watchmaking at the same level, and you get a gold case offered to it. So this, but this one, the color scheme, and in the same vein, but a little bit different on the Valjo 71, which is it's I love it. It's with a huge big counters. So the Valjo 71 is a 3-counter version of the Valjo 22. It's much more seldom, and it gives an amazing dial. It's a white gilt, which I like. It's pretty rare white gilt.
And the Valjo 22, as far as I remember, but correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't that originally designed for a pocket watch movement?
I mean, the problem is the caliber 22, the number, had been used for larger ones. So it has been used, it's very confusing, because if you take Longines, they did use a 22 as a monopusher at 2 o'clock, and they are huge, the watches are 40, because the movement is very large. But it has nothing to do with the successor, which is a modern 22, which is still quite big with 14 lines, but which really was designed, it's solely exclusively for the wristwatches. But the 71 is rare and having a.
And that's a Hoya, by the way.
It's a Hoya, It's a Hoya, and all the weights, all the engraving on the back. It's so modern. It's
a thick watch as well.
Because the hour counter also adds a little bit, and it's a watch I love, and the condition on this one is quite amazing. Beautiful. I don't wear my watches usually, but this one is one of the rare. Because I tend to destroy them if I wear them. So. I'm not, and of course an Omega, I'm a very, very early one with snapback.
Is it the 27 Crow?
No, it's 33, the
33.3.
Yeah. So the large one.
The large one,
The large one, It's also, the watch is 38.
So what is that, early 40s?
This is late 30s.
Late 30s
just
even.
Before, I had a contact with Omega for the numbers, and to have it also known if everything is correct. And it has a very particular grey dial, which is the way it is. I've seen it also on a lot of Lemanias, because as you know, Omega didn't do the chronos themselves. Basically, it's a rebranded Lemania. So I do have almost the same as a Lemania branded and as a Tissot, because they did for all of them. And basically it's a 15 TL, 15 Lemania, which was rebranded for use by Omega Tissot.
Yeah.
And I love it because it's a very, very early with step bezel, very early impermeable cases with snapback. So it gives a little bit of family.
And it's huge.
For
its age, for the 30s.
And it's always interesting because Omega chronograph from the time also in the book, we decided, some people were a little bit shocked because we really put it on the Lemania chapter. And then we mentioned that Omega used it too, and Tissot also. Yeah. But a lot of people go other way around and say, okay, it's an Omega and all. But the reality is it was designed, produced, conceived by Lemania. So
and the deal wasn't it? The deal was that Lemania will produce the movements for Tissot and Omega, and in exchange they can also produce their own watches.
Yeah, I mean the story goes that Omega Tissot bought it to have access to, because the funny thing is Omega did the very first chronograph in 1918 or 15, around that. A very large pocket watch modified. It's also described in the book as one of the very first. And then for 20 years they didn't do anything in chronographs. So they had a huge problem, and they solved it by buying Lemania. So they solved it for Tissot and for themselves. And Lemania continues, so to say, to produce a small quantity under their own name. But the real thing is Omega had a huge problem because they didn't see it coming, or they kind of missed it. So if you are looking for Omegas from the 20s, the 30s, beginning 30s, you don't find any because they had they were one among the very first. Yeah. And then they stopped it and they had to restart it by buying Lemania.
So we've been through almost all of them, but then this is a bit later. So
we have a few later ones. Yeah, I took just a few little funny things, which are not collectibles nowadays anymore, I would say, or less collectible as they used to be. Yeah. This one is a chronograph without pushers, which is a Nicolet, which is on the Londron base, quite modified. So very interestingly, you have just a crown, which is nice, but it's more than a single pusher chronograph because you can restart it. Okay. Because with a mono pusher you can't. You have start, stop, reset, so it's frozen. So you cannot restart. But this one you can start, stop, and restart. So you have the full function. It didn't sell well. I had to understand myself why, because I was fascinated by this watch, and at the time I was in close contact with Richard Habring. He was opening his workshop much before he started Habring too, with his wife. He was already married, but he didn't have launched his brand. And I found a second one of these called Transmarine with another brand name, but it's a Nicolet, and on eBay without the crown and without the system. Okay. And he was so kind that he redid it for me. So he restored it for me. He made it from scratch, the missing parts, because it's impossible to find as spare parts. And of course, at the time we discussed the beauty and the interest of it. I don't know if he already knew about the existence of these watches, but I was really a fan of these. So I brought in mine, and we discussed how to do it on a modern Valjoux base. So we basically did it together. So we have a common patent on the idea on the Valjoux, and it was sold to La Joux-Perret. But unfortunately, also when I was at La Joux, people are not interested in having chronographs without pushers. So I had to learn my lesson. Chronographs have to be recognized as such, and you need pushers. And I did really my best to sell it at the time to any kind of brands, because it allows you super cool design. Yeah. At the time, I thought it would have been nice for Panerai, because you could have kept the design untouched, and unfortunately, nobody ever bought it from La Joux. And but Richard produces it still under his own name, and he still sells a few. But this is the original, the Nicolet in steel. Most of them are gold plated. This one is steel. Very cool. And I still have, of course, the Transmarine, which Richard repaired for me. And talking about Richard, I have just another watch here, which I haven't worn for years. I took it out just for you. This was the very first watch I ever commissioned, based on my idea and his know-how. I'm a big fan of the Mido Multicenter, and the Mido Multicenter is a chrono which is known without no counters. Yeah. So you all have in the middle. So you basically have a second and a minute counter in the middle, but no small second, no hour counter, nothing. And I told him I love it, but I would need it as a rattrapante, to add a layer of complexity. And again, it's not a revolution, but it has never existed. It's more incremental. You add a layer. You made a super Big Mac, but it hasn't existed. So he was so kind, he did it for me. So you have a 60-minute counter, you have a rattrapant, it's a hand-wound base with pretty much based on IWC ideas, but not the minute counter, of course, and not the combination we did. Yeah, so what do we have else? Yeah, just talking about, I had to take another very funny thing, which is a Londron chronograph, which is a calendar. So you have the date, you have a little date, sorry, at 6 o'clock with a pointer date, a small one. You have the month and the day, and you set the calendar. You have a red dot on the turning bezel. So you on the dial, you notice that from the chronograph, 3 numbers are in red, because these are the parts where you have to go with the bezel to set the different functions. Okay. So you take the red point, you go on the dial where you see the red, and then you have to move backward and forwards over this point. Okay. It's like scratching your head, right? Yeah. And most you scratch and you go ahead, and okay, so now I have set the months. If I move my red dot at the 6 o'clock position, you can hear the click. A click. I'm changing the date. The date. And then I can do, of course, the same for the day of the week. And why I love these, because this is really what attracted me in collecting at the very beginning. These were the small little things which made me dream at night and also motivated me to make my own watches, my own patents. I have patented quite some systems and ideas, and I was fascinated by the creativity of our grandfathers, and being Swiss and being nowadays myself in the industry, I have the deepest sympathy and love for all these people, because it's quirky and they, it makes me smile. It's basically the same thing as the chronodata without the additional correctors. Yes. So the cases could be waterproof. Of course, it's not. But yes and no, it could, but it could not. It could because it has no push, no correctors. But the worst thing is the bezel must be turning without any. Yeah. So it's always all the old chronomat. It is not even dust resistant. Exactly. But it has like an intuitive. The only thing which is nice, it's much easier to set even on the wrist, because you don't have to access by the side, you don't need a pin to push or no push piece or anything. So and these are the small things. Also nowadays, as a young collector, you can still find them. I would say they were more expensive 20 years ago. So everybody talks inflation and price and interest. But I would say all the hardcore little things, they have never been so affordable. Because when I started collecting, you had really the big old guys, and they were collecting small lady chronographs, and they were almost hitting you to get them. And nowadays, all this super refined, a little bit special, not big names. You find them on kind of all kind of platforms for a few hundred euros. And these used to be much more sought after, and people knew about these. And nowadays, I don't see any interest. Also, dealers, they don't carry such kind of watches. It doesn't mean anything to them. And I have a lot of, not especially from this one, I have a few of this one, but on all these very quirky little different things where people tried different stuff without pushers, without correctors, and it's why both for me are a little bit related. When I said before, collecting is also making like little groups. Yeah. It's also what we tried in the book, and it's always to put things in perspective together. And for me, they belong a little bit in the same idea. How could we see? And both of them were not a success. Very cool. And not a success at all. Yeah. So yes, maybe just a little one here before we went and end with the 60s, where we have a little. We just have something else to see before the 60s. This is a chrono I have been hunting for years. It's a digital chrono. It looks like a pocket watch conversion. Yes, it looks, but it's because they are on the very early days, but it's still mid of the 20s. So these kind of, you could have found it also in the 1915 already, but this one is 10 years later. You see the bit from the dial design. They left also the enamel dial. It's already a metal dial. You have a few elements. And it's a very, very funny watch, because it's a digital. It looks like a sad robot to me. Yes. But it's super rare. I mean, it's known for being from Eberhard, but the movement is definitively a very large London modified. The modification is I mean, when you take off the dial, you just get afraid, because it's really it's done in a way you should or could not do it nowadays. It's really modified like. On a very harsh way, but it's excessively rare, and it's unbranded, and this is a thing you cannot just Google for it, because it's not something money can buy. It's luck and hand. And I found it last year, and it was my best purchase of last year, and I really, really wanted it. I wouldn't say I find it especially beautiful. I'm not intending to, but looked for it for 20 years before I finally could find this one. Or basically, it found me because I was someone wrote to me to ask what it is, and so I was also able to say what it is and to buy it. And so I'm super happy to own it. Yeah, and maybe we go a little bit to the 60s, 70s, also end of 60s more.
Yeah, we have 2 pieces.
We have only 2 here. Of course, I do collect now all by design, so I'm very fond of all these watches. We have just selected 2 as we had to choose, but I have one which is super nice, and my friend Nico is an NEK specialist. I've written it. He calls it the Simonet, and this is a supergraph. So the supergraph already is a rarest of all NEK chronographs, just by the name. It's very seldom, and this one has a very unique bezel, which we found. It took us a certain time. I found the watch before we knew the story about it. It was clear for me that it was not a fake, not something invented. So the bezel was unique. You have orange markings on the hour counter. You have a few orange dots. And to make a long story short, it was made for the Olympic Games in Tokyo, '64, for the shooting, Swiss shooting. And Simonet is one of them. And so Nico made the research. He found the people from the time. He found the advertisement. He found some pictures where you can recognize the watch. And he also figured out how it is used for shooting, because they have like timing aspects to the shooting, and it's a unique bezel and with unique marking on the dial with the little orange dots over there, and it's a supergraph. I love the name. I own the name, by the way. Nowadays, I registered the name because it was free of any rights. I like it, supergraph. It really brings you back to the 60s. They believed in the future, you know. Yeah. You could wear something and you would be proud you had a supergraph. You were almost Superman by wearing a supergraph, and you know, you really believed in technology, you believed in the future, you believed in space travel, and it shows a kind of positiveness to it. And I'm a huge fan of NEK, of anything NEK related. I mean, especially also the chronographs, which are unique in design. That is also something which I find really nice. I could have taken, I mean, we discussed also a nice Carrera or an old Daytona, but they probably all looks a little bit the same. You recognize the Singer design on the dial, on the hand. The hand's not from Singer, but in '69 you also had, of course, Zenith coming out with what's supposed to be the first automatic, and we can discuss it if it was caliber 11 from Hoyer, Hamilton, Buren, and Breitling, but no matter.
Or Seiko in Japanese.
Yeah, Seiko, which they came later. I mean, I'm a Swiss guy. I mean, I'm Swiss at the end of the day, so this guy came later. But no kidding, this one is just amazing by its design, which is unique. I mean, it's recognizable. We had looked at the NEK before, which is also unique. I think really Zenith has its own style. It's not comparable with any Hoyer, any Breitling. I mean, from the case design, the 386 is unique, up to the hands, the way also the counters interfere into each other. But of course, this was due to technical reasons, as the counter distance isn't very large. So they had to find a design trick to make it look good, but they managed to do it with the different colors on the dial. Yeah. And as you said also before, the watch is super thin for the time, and for automatic, it's just amazing. It wears well. It has aged pretty well, as it's still produced nowadays. And I think it's really interesting to see at the time how certain brands really managed to have a very own DNA and didn't need to take anything from others. NEK was a good example, but I think Zenith too. And Zenith had a huge range of different designs. So they were not even just focusing on one single. Right. This one became kind of an icon, but you have so many other references which are wonderful. It exists also in gold as a 381, which I also own and love, with a different dial. Most of the time it gets chocolate, so I love it.
But I'm so happy that Zenith, when they reeditioned it, they did it also in the same size.
Oh yes, I did it, and also know the new execution they do with a tenth of a second, with a super fast moving hand are very interesting. I mean, the new El Primero is I mean, Zenith is still on top. I mean, chronograph wise, they have a very nice range nowadays too. But these historical pieces have aged very well, and again, having something which is unique and recognizable across the room is not something a lot of brands are able to do nowadays. So it's good to see that back in the days you had some quite amazing brands able to do it. Yeah, and I kept a few special things to end the show, so to speak. One of them is which really got me excited a few years back when I discovered it, because it's one of the very first, if not probably the first diver chronograph. So it's called the Tituscaf. I love it. It has a little name like Angelus gave name to it. The name has been registered in 1954. Okay. So it's it precedes all the Breitling Super Ocean and all these ones. it can be rotated on the wrist for the better. It's not like a diver watch like you would expect with a bezel where you can count. This is really for stationary diving, but it has a depth meter into the plexiglass, so you can measure the depths. So it's a chronograph which has a depth gauge integrated in it. Wow. It has an amazing depth, as you can see these different steps. It's huge. It's around 50 millimeters. But also the case construction with that you can rotate it to have a better view. Yeah. Once I discovered it, I mean, I was blown away because it's why you are collecting. Actually, you want to wake up in the morning, not probably finding something you have ever seen in a book, but finding something you didn't even think it could exist. Right? It gets you excited. I took an airplane to get delivered of this, not to miss it. And I still love it.
What's the movement inside this one?
It's a Valjoux. It's a
23.
No, it's a 92.
92. Mm-hmm.
So it corresponds pretty well because it was launched in the 50s. Mm-hmm. So it is pretty logical that they used like the last execution of Valjoux, and it's also meant for militaries. So I bought it it was submitted to military. Mm-hmm. And it's unique both in design. I think it's amazingly beautiful with this red accent due to the gauge, the depth gauge.
So how does the depth gauge work?
So it exists also. It's quite common in a way. It exists also on 3-hand watches. It is with a water pressure. Mm-hmm. It is there's a hole all around, like a tube, and the pressure pushes it, and the plexiglass has been mattified, so when water hits it, it gets transparent and you see the red. Okay. And you have a lot of these Nicolai's and there are different patterns around it, but always known with 3 hands. Mm-hmm. And you had one in the 70s also from Nicolai and this one is the very first of its kind, and also at a period where probably producing such kind of glasses was still challenging, because And it's a more complex version. I have other ones with 3 hands, later ones, but the glass is by far not with also these red inserts. And this one is by far the most so my biggest fear is if I break this plexiglass. Yeah. You know how it is with all the Angelus medical, where you have a loop. Yes. You have the loop on the large, in the crystal, 90-degree loop on the crystal. If you lose these, your watch is basically gone. But this one is double the problem, I would say. So yeah, it shows a little bit when you're collecting, you're always looking for the new. Yeah, you don't find so many new things over the years, but this one I found it maybe 3 years ago, and I didn't know the existence of it before I found this one. And yeah, and on my wrist, last but not least, this is a movement I found a few years back. It's a Le Coultre square movement, which are everything I love. I love square, I love Art Deco. So the case, of course, is an own design. So I did with my friend Fabien. So we get like inspired by Art Deco, but we didn't know what the movement was used for. I mean, the movement isn't large, but it isn't small either. It is square. It has a back wind, which is quite unusual, but something Le Coultre did a lot, but not on this kind of size movement. It's a chrono with 2 pushers, which is also quite original because at the time when it was made, 1 pusher was split up to 1934. It was a 1 pusher. So this one is already a 2 pusher, and it has all the chronograph function on one counter. Okay. So it comes a little bit back to my Habring, which I designed with him, which all the counters are on one counter. And here the only difference is it's a time telling is on a separate little small dial. And
it's a bit like the first new Angelus where you had the tourbillon.
Yes, absolutely, yes. There's a bit of and you see that I designed both basically. You see that I love square cases. Fabien, my designer, always say you want to make shoe boxes, do shoe boxes. But I love shoe boxes. But this one, I think we solved the problem of because the pusher are in a very unusual location. So they are between the lugs, no chains. The dial is original and the hands too. So the only thing I had to imagine how it could have been is the case. But the hands, dial, I found it the way it is. Okay. But the movement was fully disassembled in a little box with broken axes and a lot of problems. So it took a very good friend of mine and a very talented watchmaker, Takashi from Japan, one of the best guy I know, with another friend, Luca, who they worked together. And they made it happen. And it took us 4 or 5 years. It was supposed to be ready a few years back. And of course, also making a single piece case of such kind of design. It's not feasible with traditional tools. You cannot just make it turn in machines. So yeah, it's a huge, and also just to make the sapphire also in square, and no, it is. exists. And of course, it's not an original, as you also mentioned, because we don't know if the case how it should have supposed to look like. Maybe it was not even supposed to be a wristwatch, which is also possible. Mm-hmm. But I think the size is pretty cool, and it shows me also, because I'm no part of the industry and I'm head of innovation, whatever it means. But I mean, we're thinking about new products. It shows that all our grandfathers and grand-grandfathers had an amazing imagination, and it's not because it didn't went through production that they didn't thought about it.
Yeah.
I mean, an MBNF and Max Busser existed. There were no markets, but people who developed a square chronograph with back wind and the crazy dial layout existed. So it never found a way. They were never produced in series, but nonetheless, it brings us also to not to believe that we're more creative than all our grandfathers and others. We were probably not. And it's funny to go back in time and find things you would have not expected to exist at the time. And this one really, for me, exemplifies this feeling of you can go back with vintage pieces and still find something which is not supposed to have existed, and which will blow your mind and show you that they were quite creative. And this one it's exactly what happened when I found it in a little box and with only spare part and the dial, and I said, one day I have to make it a whole watch.
It's a great story.
That's here it is.
And I mean, it's as you said, it just means that you think you're creative, but people many decades ago
had the same thoughts before,
exactly.
and sometimes you really create something you're super proud, and one day you find exactly the same as a pocket watch, and
So let's end it on that note. I think it's been really great. So thanks again for taking your time.
Yes, my pleasure.
One thing before you go, or before we end the video, you talked about your book, referenced the book quite a few times.
Yes.
And this is my copy.
Yes.
You gave this book to me when it came out years and years ago. But what you have not done is you have not signed the book. So I have a pen, and I'd like to ask you to
My pleasure, of course. I didn't sign it.
No, you didn't sign it. And you wrote it with, with Joël, and hopefully once we'll be able to talk to Joël, and then I'll ask him to sign it again, and then it will be the collection is done with the book and both signatures of both writers.
With my pleasure.
But you started, and let's just move it away. And while Sébastien signs the book, I would like to thank you for your time again. Thank you for your time, Sébastien, in showing us your watches. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and enjoy your watches.